All right, Masechet Makot Chav Bet Amud Bet. This week we are going to be. Let me actually zoom out and ask a question. Which trumps what? The Torah Shebechtav or Torah Sheba'al Peh? What's more important?
Important.
Yeah.
I think in certain aspects Torah Sheba'al Peh. Because that's like if we don't believe in something there, so then it's a problem. I don't know.
Shimon, which do you think trumps which? Or which is more important, Torah Shebechtav or Torah Sheba'al Peh?
I don't know if I feel like it's a trick question. Trumps is like Torah Shebechtav is like more heavy. Like people are like there's before in the Torah, but like it's useless. Like otherwise you bunch of tzedakah and you're waiting to film between your eyes. Like you need Torah.
Good story.
You don't want to be a bunch of tzedakah. Okay. So right, meaning on the one hand, Torah Sheba'al Peh, trumps in the sense that it defines how you understand the Torah Shebechtav, and on the other hand, it's all based on Torah Shebechtav, right? And then you have cases where Afkinu and things where the Torah Sheba'al Peh uproots the Torah Shebechtav, but the fact that those are rare exceptions shows that normally that's not how it works, right? Tano, do you mind just muting the background noise? Is that possible? If you're listening. So, Eric, can you just mute? How do I mute him?
You can just turn your volume down. You don't need to hear him.
So what we'll be talking about this week is basically Torah Shebechtav, which is represented by Sefer Torah, and Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is represented by Chachamim, or a Talmid Chacham. And if you have to kind of choose which one to honor, which one should be honored. And so the spoiler alert is that they should both be honored, but we need to understand why they should be honored. And we'll see that there's two sugyas that seem to be in tension with each other. And we'll basically just go through a bunch of mefarshim to see how each of them understand how to resolve that contradiction, and see kind of a chiddush of the Yun Yaakov at the end. Okay?
It's not really the same question as which is more important.
That's correct. I was just...
It was a clickbait title.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just saying, like,
clickbait.
Physical Sefer Torah versus a Talmid Chacham, I mean, it's a separate question than Torah versus...
That's right. You are correct. It is clickbait. Okay, so let me ask. Fine. A Sefer Torah and a Talmid Chacham, which one deserves more kavod?
Talmid Chacham.
Why?
Talmid Chacham is the walking Sefer Torah.
Okay.
Oh, very good. Also, Talmid Chacham put in effort. He gets respect for becoming Talmid Chacham.
As opposed to the inanimate object.
Yeah, Torah is holy, but it's Shemida. It's not like doesn't get credit for being the Torah. Both, like, do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? No.
I mean, it's imbued with kedusha.
Correct, but it didn't do anything for it. Whereas Talmid Chacham is a person who became Talmid Chacham by work.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. All right, let's see what the Gemara says, okay? So, thank you. So, we're going to start with Mishnah in Masechet Makkot. So, the Mishnah is talking about Malkot, the punishment of Makkot. So, it says, Kamen Malkinoto, Arbim Chaser Achat. 40 minus 1, right? Shneimar b'mitzpar arba'im. The Torah tells us how many lashes do you have? Sorry? 40 minus 1. Yeah.
Is 39.
That's right. 39. Very good. Okay, so the Torah tells us that when somebody gets Makkot, they get b'mispar arba'im. Minyat shehu samuch la'arba'im. So b'mispar is understood to mean next to 40, not exactly 40, i.e. 39. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, arba'im shlemot hu lokeh. Rabbi Yehuda says no, that he gets 40. Ve'echan hu lokeh et ha'yitira ben chtefa. But the final one is in between his shoulder blades, not on his back, which I guess lessens the blow. So he says it's still a full 40, but there is something about that last one that's a little bit different. But the Tanakama says that he doesn't do the last one at all. En om dinoto el b'makot ruyot lishtalesh. and they measure a person's fitness, capability, his capacity to receive lashes, and based on that, that's how they measure. In other words, this is an upper bound, no more than 39. Imdu lekabel 40. Let's say they measure he's physically fit, he's able to get all 40 without it, being a potential danger to his life. Then they do some of the 40. Then they measure him again, and they find out that actually he's in really bad shape, worse than they originally estimated, so then they stop. They don't do the full 40. And the reverse also, imdu lekabel 18. Let's say in the beginning they said, he's frail, he can only handle 18. Mishelaka amdu sheyacholu lekabel 40 patur. And then they do 18, and it turns out that he has more strength than they originally thought. They still stop anyway. In other words, you're finding reasons not to do it. Is basically the idea.
But why bother to do the assessment first if you didn't change?
If you can change.
Yeah, and we don't give more, but we do give less. I mean, why do you do the assessment?
Why don't you just start and see what happens?
Yeah.
Because if you do an assessment in the beginning, that's a good question.
It's an upper bound, though. So that's good. That means that it will always be less than the assessment at the beginning. Maybe the strategy to make him get less.
Yeah, if you assess I think that's the second case. If you assess 18 in the beginning, and then you see when you get to 18 you can keep going, you still stop. If you didn't assess him, you'd have to keep going.
Yeah.
So it gives you more room for leniency. And then the Gemara asks, my timer. What's the reason? Iktiv 40 b'mispar, hava mina 40 b'minyana. Asher ichtiv b'mispar 40, minyan shu sochem et 40. Okay, so it's the order the words teaches you. And this is really what we'll focus on, this next phrase. Amar Rava. Rava said, Kama Tpshai shar Inshai. How foolish are all other people.
What a great line.
It's a great line. It's the name of the shir. You look at the top. Kama Tpshai shar Inshai. They stand up before Sefer Torah, but they don't stand up before a great scholar. Why does that make them foolish? That in the Torah itself it writes 40 lashes, but then Chazal came and reduced it by 1 through Torah Shebaal Peh. So therefore people are foolish. So before we go through the whole shir, what do you think Rava is saying here?
I don't know what he's saying, but I find that the lashon that he uses interesting because he's saying if you translated it literally, then he says that the Torah says 40 and then the Chazal reduced it by 1. Is that literally what he says?
That's what it is.
Which is a funny thing to say because it's like you're saying that the Torah says you should put tefillin between your eyes and the Chazal came and moved them up. You didn't move them, they interpreted the Torah. They're saying that the Torah is saying 40 really means 39. They didn't take one away.
Uh-huh.
Well, no, you tell me, but I feel like that's the way Torah Shebaal Peh interacts with Torah Shebaal. It's an interpretation, not changing Torah Shebaal.
I agree with you. It's an interesting language. Rava, who obviously is not that's doiki, right? Rava is one of the Pharisees. That he's using a phrasing which seems to imply that Chazal actually changed through Torah Shebaal Peh what the Torah originally said, as opposed to just revealing the actual meaning of Torah Shebichtav.
It could be semantic. It could be he's just saying, but that's what he means. That they took away 1 by interpreting it that way.
But the way I think you're right to notice it because it is a bit of a strange language. It's a radical language. The way I think we can understand it is that basically it means if I didn't have the Chazal coming and telling me this is what Torah Shebaal Peh means, I would interpret it to be 40, like a tzeduki, like a carrot. So they reduced it, not in the sense that they came and did something that wasn't always there, but the fact that they revealed it effectively reduced it for all intents and purposes. But you're right. I think it is we wouldn't have been surprised if he phrased it in a different way. We'll put it that way. What do you think he's getting at, though? Why should the fact that Chazal through Torah Shebaal Peh teach me that the Malchus gets reduced by 1? Why does that make people who don't stand up for Torah scholars fools? What's the connect? Like, what does one have to do with the other?
They deserve respect for like if you stand up for Sefer Torah implying you respect the Torah, right? And then these Talmid Chachamim are so powerful that they're able to change / interpret what's in the Torah, and you're not standing up for them. It's like a kal v'chomer.
Okay, so it's so good. I love that you use the phrase kal v'chomer. You're saying kal v'chomer the rabbis. In other words, if Sefer Torah you stand up, of course you have to stand up for the rabbis who interpret it.
Right.
Good. So if we look at the next source in Kiddushin, Hibaylahu, a question was raised. Kiddushin Lamed Gimel Bed. Ma'ula mod mipnei Sefer Torah. Should we stand before a Sefer Torah? B'chilka v'b'simon v'b'elazar amrei, kal v'chomer.
Oh.
Mipnei lomdei omdim, mipanei lo kol sheken. What's the kal v'chomer here? We stand up for the scholar who learns Torah. So kal v'chomer should stand up for the Torah itself. Right?
They're coming in all directions.
Right.
The assumption was very standard.
So what's the problem? You can't kal v'chomer. You can't kal v'chomer both ways, right? You can't say this kal v'chomer that, but that kal v'chomer that. Very good. Very good. Oh, good. That's the problem.
When you have the 40 in terms of 39, is it the Chachamim interpreted it that way, or is this halacha Moshe Sinai?
That's kind of what Shimon was saying, right? Rava's language seems to give you the mistaken impression that Chachamim came and interpreted that way, but our the way we understand it is that Torah Sheba'al Peh comes in and reveals what Torah Sheba'al Peh is the proper way to understand it, right? It's not that they came and interpreted it that way. Why are you asking? What's the?
Because I think there's a difference between the like Atar Rabban Batrula, so then okay, that's believing what Moshe passed down and whoever is passing it down from him on and on. But the Gemara in Kiddushin is saying Mipnei Lomdea, the people that are studying it, not the people that are passing it down. So I think there's the chain of passing it down, and there's the people that are learning it, and that they're scholars.
Very good. So you are mitchaven to the first set of answers in the commentaries. That the difference between the Gemara in Makkot and the Gemara in Kiddushin, the reason why the Kal v'chomers are not a contradiction, is that it's basically from someone who learns Torah. I can say Kal v'chomer, the Torah itself, and then the Torah Kal v'chomer, a Gav Rabbah who passes down the tradition. That there's kind of a difference between, the Gadol Hador, let's say, or a great scholar, and just a person who learns, who's a scholar, but not. And Sefer Torah is like wedged in between in terms of the order of priority.
The other question is in theory, the assumption would be that according to Chavkia and Rabbi Simon and Rabbi Lazar, they seem to have a source that we stand for Tamei Chachamim, like just stand like that. They hold that's it. Their question is, how do you know you stand for Sefer Torah? Because we stand for Tamei Chachamim, it's Kal v'chomer we should.
Right.
So seemingly they hold that's a given that we stand for Sefer Torah. So why in our Gemara in Makkot do we need you start asking why should we stand for Sefer Torah? Why should we stand for Tamei Chachamim? They have that as like a given.
Right. Exactly. That actually aligns with the Gemara in Makkot, because Rava says, look how foolish these people are who don't stand up. Meaning, he's also assuming that they should, right?
He says but both of them have different ones as assumptions, because he says the Kaimim Sefer Torah. He says we do stand for Sefer Torah, but they have to come and ask reason why we should, because we stand for Tamei Chacham. They have different ones as given. Right.
I think that's the problem. Like, how do we understand these two sugyas in light of each other? Okay. Yeah, I think you're right. In the end, everyone agrees that you should stand for both, except for the source that we're about to see, which is a bit of a different thing. But the question is, right, like you said, what's the kind of the foundation and what's the thing you learn too? Now let's just finish the Gemara in Kiddushin. Rabbi Eli, Rabbi Yaakov Bar Zavdi, Havu Yatvei. So these two rabbis were sitting. One Chalif Vaza, Rabbi Shimon Bar Abba. So this other Rav, Rabbi Shimon Bar Abba, passed in front of them. V'kamu makmei. So they stood up because he passed by them. Amalu, he said to them, Chada datun chakim evan chaver. So first of all, you guys are scholars, and I am a fellow student of the Torah. I'm not your Rebbe. You shouldn't stand up for me. I'm a peer, right? I'm a chaver. Ve'od, and he says, but furthermore, klum Torah medet b'pnei lomdea. You are sitting and learning Torah now. So you have to stand up for me who walks by? Since when does a Torah have to stand up for those? Why does the Torah get stood up for by those who are learning it? Okay? So what does he mean? Savel like Rabbi Elazar. He reasoned like Rabbi Elazar. Damar Rabbi Elazar, ein talmid chacham rashai la'amod mipnei rabo b'sha'ah shosek b'Torah. if a student is learning, and his Rebbe walks by, he's not allowed to stand up for his Rebbe, because that would be a disgrace to the Torah that he's learning. But then another twist, Lait Allah Abaye. Abaye used to curse people who held by this opinion, meaning, of course, you should stand up for your Rebbe. So we see here that there's kind of all these different shitot in this whole thing. What's the most important? Okay, let's look at the Mefarshim to understand how they interpret this stira. So we'll start with the Rif. Okay, Harif. So in the photo grab on the left side, he says as follows, right? Venir le'ani udaiti on the first line under Harif, in the middle line. Venir le'ani udaiti l'taris kushiat haran מה שהביא על מה שאמר שם בקידושין, רבי אלעזר ורבי יעקב בן זיבדיה ויואט וחליף ועזר ורבי שמעון בר אבא, כמה מקמי אחר וכו'. ועוד כלום תורה עומדת בפני לומדיה וכו', לפי ריש רש"י, לפי שעוסקים וכו'. הרי קרא לדיד הוא תורה עצמה, לדידי קרא לומדיה. So that's recapping the sugi that we just saw. ובזה אני מבאר, and the Rif says, this is how I explain this, the contradiction. שיש שני מיני תלמידי חכמים. There are two types of Torah scholars. האחד בשעה שהתלמיד חכם עוסק בתורה. One when he's learning. ואז הוא גדול מספר תורה. So when a Torah scholar is learning Torah, he is greater than a physical sefer Torah. Okay? ועל זה אמר רבא, הני טפשאי דקיימי מקמי ספר תורה ולא קיימי מקמי גב רבא, העוסק בתורה. שיפה כוחו מהספר תורה. So the way he understands, he says the Gemara in Makkot, and Rava says the people who are fools are the ones who stand up for Sefer Torah, but not for a great scholar. That's talking about a great scholar in the sense of someone who's learning Torah at the time. So those people are foolish because you should stand up for sure for a scholar who's learning, because that's greater than the Torah, a physical Torah. And he says, V'yesh Talmid Chacham, but then there's also scholars, Shelamdu Torah, who have a lot of Torah knowledge, but v'achshav einam oskim ba, right? But at that particular moment, they're not engaged in learning. V'afilu achi chayavin lakum mipneihem, and for them as well, you have to stand up, even if they're not learning. Uvazeh amru kal v'chomer, she'im mipnei lomdei omdim midachtiv v'adatar pnei zaken, zeh shekana chochma mipnei alakol sheken chayavim lakum. In other words, when we learn the kal v'chomer of, if you stand up before somebody who's learned Torah, you for sure have to stand up before Torah itself. So that Kal V'chomer has the Sefer Torah more important, but that's talking about someone who's learned but isn't engaged in learning right now. Mm-hmm. Versus the people who are foolish that stand up for a Torah but not for a Gava Rabbah, that's talking about someone who's actively engaged in learning. That's the chiluk that the Rif proposes to explain the contradiction.
Standing up for a person that's actively learning?
In other words, you have to stand up for a Torah scholar no matter what, and you have to stand up for Sefer Torah no matter what. Right? But the question is, how do I derive them? Right? So in Makkot, it seems that I stand up for a Sefer Torah from the scholar.
Right.
And Kiddushin, I stand up for the opposite. I stand up for the scholar from the Sefer Torah. So the answer given is, we're talking about someone who's learning at the moment and someone who's not learning at the moment. That's the difference. If someone's not learning, so then I have to stand for them. So for sure I have to stand for Sefer Torah, which is greater than a scholar who has learned.
Wait, if they're not learning, I for sure need to stand for them?
Yeah, if they're a Torah scholar.
We're talking about the person who needs to stand up.
I'm saying according to the Rif, if a great rabbi walks in the room,
right,
he's not learning, he's just walking, so you stand up when he walks in the room, right? So, since you have to stand up for him then, you definitely have to stand up for a Sefer Torah that gets brought into a room.
Right. That's
Kiddushin. Makkot says, I have to stand up when a Sefer Torah gets brought in, so I for sure have to stand up if somebody who's learning is there.
Walks in?
I guess, yeah.
Because the Gemara in Kiddushin is, like what we said, is about the person. Like the case in Kiddushin is about the person that's learning, whether he has to stand up or not. Right?
The person in Kiddushin is about two people. Well, there's a case of two people who are learning and another rabbi walks by.
Yeah, and the Gemara says, "Damar Rabbi Elazar, en talmid chacham rashay la'amod mipnei rabo b'sha'a she'osek b'Torah." So the subject of the person learning or not learning is the one that's standing up.
You're right. So the discussion in the Rif is not in the story. It's in the first half of Kiddushin, I think, about the teaching of Kal v'chomer mipnei lomdei ha'omdim mipnei lo kol sheken. What you're saying is correct, that it doesn't seem to be taken into account whether the standee is learning and how that should affect it. But so that's a good point. But leaving out the status of the one who needs to do the standing, it's more about the one who you need to honor. Right. What is their status, I think. And whether the person who needs to do the standing is learning or not is a good question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. It's like a little weird answer to say that if the person walking in is learning. I don't know. At least that seems... But.
So we'll see that not everyone agrees with the Rif's explanation. But yes. Okay. The next source is the Pnei Yehoshua. So if we just go to the next page, Pnei Yehoshua, he says as follows: V'nir le'ni yodaiti, dehacha lo ayri ela bestam chacham. So he has a bit of a different, same idea, but a different nuance that maybe Yona will be a little bit easier for you to accept. He says the case in Kiddushin is just talking about a regular Torah scholar. Okay? Mipnei lomdei ha'omdim, mipnei sefer Torah l'kol sheken. Right? V'afilu achi chayvin lamon b'fneihem. You still have to stand for them. V'shapir havu kal v'chomer l'sefer Torah. So the kal v'chomer makes sense. Masha'ein ken hatam, but by Makkot, what's the problem? Why does Rava curse the people? Ayri begavra rabba mamish, right? You notice that Rava uses the language of gavra rabba, so that doesn't mean just your run-of-the-mill sefer Talmud Chacham. This is what I said before. It's more that you're talking about like a real gadol dor, okay? Sharui l'shev b'Sanhedrin, okay? You're talking about someone who's the creme de la creme. De'adif mi sefer Torah k'damasik v'atu rabbanan b'atu chada. Because not every random guy who, even like just the guy who gets smicha or whatever, he's not at the level that he can come and do something like when it says 40, it means 39. Those are people who have a Masorah, who are Gdolei Ador. So for that type of person, you have to stand up for even more than you would for a Sefer Torah, because they are the real bearers of the tradition. They are more important than the Sefer Torah in a sense. But other than those exceptional people, like a random Torah scholar, so then you have to stand for him for sure. But a Sefer Torah still has a Kedusha that outweighs him. That's how the Pnei Yehoshua answers the thing. If we go back to the Eitz Yosef, he gives a third explanation in this general approach that's also a little bit different. The Eitz Yosef says, where it says Ted Zayin. So he says, Hikshu HaMefarshim, the Misugah de Kiddushin daf lamed gilu mashma de Sefer Torah adif mitam chacham, she'amru sham mipnei lomdei ha'omdim mipnei lo kol sheken. Mikan mashma diyoter la'orei lachol kavod l'talmud chacham yoter miSefer Torah. V'ayim b'marasha shetir etzot. Okay, we'll see the Marasha actually in a bit, because the Marasha gives a different answer. So he says, now the Eitz Yosef, Umori v'Rabbi something zal, Tiretz de'ahid kidushin damin mipnei lomdei ha'omdim mipnei lo kol sheken ma'ari belomdea delav gava rabba leorot ela shehu baal mashmaot v'talmudo biyado v'zeh zaken shekana chokhma ve'elav ha'katuv omer v'adatav b'nei zaken. So his chiluk is slightly different. His chiluk is that in Kiddushin, when it talks about a regular, when it talks about a Talmud Chacham who is lower than a Sefer Torah, so it's about someone who doesn't have, let's call it like the ability to give psak. He's a koil guy, but he's not a rabbi who has the lehorot. He doesn't have the authority to teach. Mashen can amin Torah atzma l'kol sheken ve'idi dan, but by Rava, where it says David kavachomer mi sefer Torah ma'ir gavarabba. What's a gavarabba? Dahainu moreh horaot, someone who actually gives psak. De'adif mi sefer Torah sheyodeu be'ezer Torah kedamar v'amurabba b'batu chada. Okay, so essentially, the way I understand it, Yosef, he's like a less extreme version of the Pnei Yehoshua. He reduces the gap between the categories. Right? Pnei Yehoshua said gavarabba is someone who sits on the Sanhedrin, and the regular Talmud Chacham is basically anybody else. Whereas Eitz Yosef says it's someone who can give psak versus someone who's not at a level to give psak. Okay, but all three of them, the Rif, the Pnei Yoshua, and the Yitzchak, they all distinguish between the types of Talmidei Chachamim in the two sugyas to answer the question. If now we turn to the second set of Mefarshin, so they actually give a second approach to answering the sugya. And they say, you've been misunderstanding this entire thing. They said, it's true that in Kiddushin, it's explicit Kal V'chomer. Right? In Kiddushin, it's Kal V'chomer b'pnei lomdei omdim b'pnei lo kol sheken. And we assumed also a Kal V'chomer in the other direction. We assumed the Kal V'chomer in the other direction for Makkot. Why did we assume that? Because Shimon said it's a Kal V'chomer. That's why we assumed it. But the Meiri and the Maharsha say, maybe it's not a Kal V'chomer in Kiddushin. Maybe the motivation is a little bit different. Because if we look at, in Makkot, because in Makkot, what does Rava say? How foolish are all the Amcha that they stand before a Sefer Torah, they don't stand before a great man. Right? Because it says 40 and they came and reduced it by 1. It doesn't necessarily mean that a Gav Rabbah is greater than a Sefer Torah. It could just mean that maybe they're on the same level, right? In other words, like, if you stand for one thing, and there's something that's of equal importance, so you should stand for the thing of equal importance, not that it's greater, necessarily. So if we look at the Meiri says, Uma she'amru b'masechet Makkot kama Tepshai, lo she'ei talmid chacham gadol mimena. It's not that a scholar is greater than the Sefer Torah, ela kach perusho, ho'il ve'hem yod'im et HaTorah, since this Gav Rabbah knows the Torah, kol kach, shemitoch ma shehem dorshim ba, nir'im kesotrim divreihem, v'adai ru'ilemo mipnehem. Right? If they're scholars to the point where they're coming and saying something that seems to contradict the Sefer Torah, they're on the same level, so you should stand for them the same as you stand for a Sefer Torah. And in that case, it's not really a contradiction to what we saw in Kiddushin. Maharsha gives a bit of a different answer. He says, Kama Tepshai Shar Inshei, Rotzeh lomar, on the first line in the middle, Shar Inshei hem amei haaretz, shebozim et haTalmidei Chachamim. Okay, so who are these Shar Inshei? He says it means, amei haaretz, that they insult or spurn the Talmidei Chachamim. K'tamrina b'perek Aleph, b'perek Chelek, it says in Sanhedrin. So let's actually quickly see in Sanhedrin, the next source, what is he quoting? So Rava Amar, note that Rava is the one saying this. In Sanhedrin, it's talking about the context in Perek Chelek are who are people that are apikorsim. How do you define an apikoris, right? And people don't get olam haba. So Rava gives an example. Kagon hani debei binyamin asya, like those who lived in the house of Benjamin the doctor. Okay, the Amrei used to say, "Maya hani lan rabbanan." So what good or benefit do the rabbanan bring? Me'olam lo sharulan orva velo asrulan yona. Right? They've never permitted a raven for us. They've never forbidden a dove for us. In other words, he's arguing. What?
They don't change that much.
They don't change it, right? They come and they give you all these nice pilpulim and they add all these, but they don't actually change the Torah itself. So, like, well, what good are they? What are they for? I don't need them, right? So that's a definition of apikoros according to Rabbah. So he says here that this is an example of these shar inshei, right? These people who mock the Talmidei Chachamim for not really doing anything. Rashi says on that Gemara, Lo amru lan shum chidush shelo matzinu b'Torah ad kan lashono, that it means that they're not mechadesh anything. Ulahachi kaim makme sefer Torah velo kaim makme Gav Rabbah. So he's explaining, first of all, that's what Rava's responding to, is these people who they'll stand up for a sefer Torah because that's Torah shebichtav, but then a rabbi walks in and they're like, I'm not going to stand up for this. There's obviously also like a polemical with the tzedukkim and all that going on here as well. Okay, then it says the Amar Sharei Tepshai Inun Deshapir Hanulan Rabbanan Teilu b'Sefer Torah Ktiv Mem V'Atu Rabbanan U'Batzu Chada Hanulan Behachi De'ilav Rabbanan Efshar She'amut Hanilke Alei Malkot Arba'im V'Hashda. Okay, so do you understand what the Maharsha is saying? He's the first one of these mefarshim that gives significance to the idea of the Makkot. Like Rava is saying, Kama Tepshai Shar Inshei, that the rabbis can reduce the Makkot by 1. Like, what a bizarre example to give. Okay, like, there's so many more examples. So it's saying no, because what they're coming and saying is like what Rava says in Sanhedrin. These are people who are saying the rabbis don't come in mechadesh anything interesting. So Rava comes and says, Chazal came and reduced the number of lashes by 1. So if you were getting lashes, you wouldn't say that they're not machadish anything because they're reducing your punishment and they're potentially saving someone's life if that last lash is what would push them over the edge. And not to mention all the things in the Mishnah about how, you measure 18 and then you exempt them. Rav is saying that this claim that ein chidush but divrei chachamim is ridiculous. So that's why Tipshei shar Inshei. So according to the Maharsha, you see he's totally changing we saw this as a stira between two sugyas, the kav v'chomer this or kav v'chomer that way. For the Maharsha, we totally misunderstood. Rava isn't saying that a Torah scholar is greater than a Sefer Torah. He's saying, how foolish are people who stand before a Sefer Torah and don't stand before Chachamim? He's just making a hashkafic point about the fact that Chachamim are mechadesh things on top of a Sefer Torah. It's not making a claim about which is more important or more deserving of respect. So that's not a problem, right? The true answer is still what we saw in Kiddushin, that you actually do derive from a Sefer Torah to the Sefer Torah milomdea omdim Sefer Torah l'kol shekain. That's still correct. Rava's just observing something about Amei Haaretz here. That's how he concludes here, the Maharsha, where he says, that what it says in Kiddushin is the real reason. The Kal V'chomer, that you stand before a Torah scholar, so you stand before a Sefer Torah. Okay, so that's the explanation of the Maharsha. And just to quickly conclude the Yun Yaakov, if we flip back, so he actually gives a lengthy thing where I thought it was actually it's an interesting chiddush that he gives, a way of understanding the sugya. He also tries to understand what's the significance of the idea of the Makkot being reduced by one. So he says as follows: Kama Tipshai shar Inshei, first line. Kar lehu tipshim la'ayda osim shtut ki l'da'atam en koach be'achachamim la'akor dvar me'atorah. Okay, ve'im ken nju be'onesh chamur im ovrin al lav sheyesh bo Makkot. לכך קרא לכם טיפשים. ומה שיקשו התוספות ושאר המפרשים שסוגיה זו זוטר, מה שדית בפרק כמה דקידושין, מפני לומדי העומדים, I'm בספרי שבות יעקב, סימן ילאו. So he says, if you want to understand the resolution to this stira between Kiddushin and Makkot, I refer you to my own sefer, the Shvut Yaakov, which I actually checked and didn't see him answer this stira, but I may not have understood what he was saying. But he says here in this commentary, but how can we understand this on a simple level? Nearly al pi madiita betosfot b'sanhedrin daf yud shemadchikim meod delama amrinan malkot b'mkom mita omedet. That the Gemara in Sanhedrin discusses this idea that there's an opinion which says that malkot are meant to replace death. In other words, the punishment of Makkot, it acts as a filler for someone who's chayav mita, so you give him lashes, and it's kilu an equivalent of getting punished with death. Okay? And it's a machlokes. One says yes, one says no. So if you say Makkot b'makom mida omedet, uve'emet apshat nearly pashut al shem madi'ita b'midrash. What does it say in the Midrash? Lama malkin mem. Why do you give 40 lashes? It says in the Midrash, lefi she'avar ala Torah shenitna lemem. Right, the Torah was given in 40 days. So if you violate the Torah actively, so then you get malkut, which is 40. Right? V'chayev mita la neshama shenotzra b'mem. And your soul has to be, taken care. Like chayev mita la neshama, your soul gets killed. Because the soul was created in 40 days. The first 40 days of the fetus is forming is when the soul, I guess, is formed, according to Midrash. So we see here that the Makkot are meant to destroy the soul. I'm not sure what that means, but the point that the Yun Yaakov is making is Lefikach Yilkem Mem. Ad kan v'im ken haynu taimid derava the Amar Malkot b'mekom mita omedet. Right. So we see here that if I say that there's 40 lashes, so then I can make the case that Malkot has been makom mita, because the Midrash says it's because the soul was created in 40 days. But according to the one who says no, you don't do 40 like Rabbi Yehuda said, but rather the Tanna Kama that you do 39. You can't say that the lashes take the place, that they're meant to be in place as like a substitution for mita, because you only get 39 lashes, and you have to go all the way to 40 if it was really going to replace the mita, right? Therefore, what? What's he? So why do we care about all this? Uvazeh beturat kama tipshai shar inche. So now we can understand what Rava is saying when he says, how foolish are all of these other Amei Haaretz. Tekaime makme sefer Torah. They stand up before a Torah. Velo kaime makme gav, but they don't stand up before a Torah scholar. Why? Deha be'emet kavod chachamim adif. Really, you should stand up for the Torah scholar. She'arei over al divrei chachamim chayav mita. Because there's a principle, a well-known principle, that anyone who violates the words of the chachamim is chayav mita. This is something we find throughout the Talmud. So I know that anyone who violates the words of Chazal is chayav mita. So if you want to say, okay, it's true that if I violate the words of Chazal, let's say I'm chayav mita, but also if I violate the Torah, I'm chayav mita. Why? Because I get Makkot, and Makkot b'makom mita umedet. So then there's no. It's not that the rabbis are greater than the Torah, because I get punished for death there also. So then he says, Val zeh ka'amar de'ilu be'oreita k'tiv mem. So it's true that the Torah says 40. V'atu rabanu batzu lehuchada. The rabbis came and reduced it by 1, so it's only 39. V'im ken le'kal mem makkot b'makom mita umedet. And then you can't say that the Makkot take the place of Mita. V'im ken ad korchach kavod chachamim adif. So therefore you have to conclude from that the honor of the Chachamim is greater, because if you violate the Chachamim, you chayav Mita, but if the Makkot is only 39, and that's one less than Mita, therefore kavod Chachamim is adif. Now, what's kind of funny about this holy in Yaakov is all these principles that he's invoking to show you that kavod Chachamim adif, like anyone who violates the words of Chazal is chayav Mita, and that you reduce the Makkot by 1, those are all statements of Chazal. Right? In other words, like, Chazal are the ones who are telling you, if you violate our word, you're chayav mita. The whole thing's fixed, right? So it's very nice that you then conclude from that, the kavod chachamim must be greater. But they're the ones who are telling you that to begin with. Right, but leave it as it may. Li and Yaakov, it's an interesting way to kind of add some more light to this sugya.
I think there's something that's